The USS Alan M. Sumner wasn't supposed to be a legend. She was just another destroyer. Hull number DD-692 rolled off the assembly line at the Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Kearney, New Jersey. Named after a Marine Corps captain who died in World War I. She was commissioned on January 26, 1944, with most of her crew fresh out of boot camp and training schools. These young men, many who had never been to sea before, had no idea they were about to become part of one of the most intense naval engagements of the Pacific War. To understand what happened that night in Ormoc Bay, you need to understand what the Alan M. Sumner was. She wasn't just any destroyer. She was the lead ship of a new class, the most heavily armed destroyers the world had ever seen. At 376 feet long and displacing about 2,200 tons, she carried 6 5-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, 12 40 anti-aircraft guns, 11 20 cannons, and 10 torpedo tubes. She was built to fight, built to protect the fleet from air attacks, submarines, and enemy surface ships. But more than her weapons, she had something special, the latest radar technology that could see through darkness and weather, giving her eyes when everyone else was blind. The war in the Pacific had reached a critical point by late 1944. The Americans had landed on Leyte in the Philippines in October, and the Japanese were desperate to hold onto this vital territory. They knew that losing the Philippines meant losing their supply lines to the oil fields of Borneo. Without that oil, their war machine would grind to a halt. So they threw everything they had into the fight, including their newest and most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. Captain Norman J. Sampson commanded the Alan M. Sumner, and he was no rookie. He'd learned his seamanship in the brutal waters of the North Atlantic, where German U-boats hunted in wolf packs and storms could be as deadly as enemy torpedoes. His experience would prove invaluable, but even he couldn't have imagined what his ship would face. The destroyer had arrived in the Pacific in September 1944, stopping at Pearl Harbor for training exercises. The crew practiced gunnery, anti-submarine warfare, damage control, all the skills they'd need to survive in combat. But training could only prepare you so much. As one sailor later recalled, standing on the deck of the Sumner for the first time made him feel lonely and isolated, like he was a million miles from home. In November, the Alan M. Sumner joined the Fast Carrier Task Force, the mighty armada of aircraft carriers that was the spearhead of America's advance across the Pacific. The destroyer's job was to protect these valuable ships, to stand between them and any threat, whether it came from the air, from beneath the waves, or from enemy surface ships. She performed this duty well, but it was relatively quiet work. The crew began to think maybe they'd gotten lucky, maybe they'd make it through the war without seeing real action. They were wrong. The situation on Leyte was deteriorating for the Japanese by early December 1944. American forces had established a beachhead and were pushing inland, but the Japanese were frantically reinforcing their troops. They ran what they called the TA operations, high-speed convoy runs that would dash into Ormoc Bay under cover of darkness, unload troops and supplies, and escape before dawn brought American aircraft. These runs had been surprisingly successful. In fact, by December, the Japanese had actually managed to double their garrison on Leyte. The Americans knew they had to stop these reinforcement runs. They tried using PT boats, those small, fast torpedo boats that could sneak in close to shore. They tried destroyer sweeps. They even tried air attacks, but the monsoon season had turned the airfields into muddy bogs, grounding most of the planes. Something had to be done, and fast. On December 2, 1944, intelligence reports came in that another Japanese convoy was heading for Ormoc Bay. Admiral James Kaufman, commander of the Philippine Sea Frontier, needed to stop them. He had just received 3 of the Navy's newest destroyers, the Alan M. Sumner and her sisters, USS Mole and USS Cooper. These ships seemed perfect for the job. With their heavy forward firepower, they could charge into the bay, guns blazing, and destroy the convoy before the Japanese knew what hit them. The mission briefing was simple, maybe too simple. Intelligence said there would be a few lightly armed transports escorted by a single destroyer. It should be, in the words of the briefing officers, easy pickings. The three destroyers would enter the bay just after midnight, destroy the convoy, and get out before the Japanese could respond. What could go wrong? Eugene Anderson, a third-class signalman on the Allen M. Sumner, remembered the apprehension as they prepared for the mission. They'd all seen the kamikazes by then, those Japanese pilots who turned their planes into guided missiles, sacrificing themselves to destroy American ships. The idea of going into a confined bay at night without air cover made everyone nervous. But orders were orders. As the sun set on December 2nd, the three destroyers left Leyte Gulf and headed north toward Ormoc Bay. The weather had been miserable all day, heavy rain that kept American fighters grounded at Tacloban Airfield. Now it had cleared to a grey, misty overcast. There was a full moon above the clouds, its light diffusing through the mist to create an eerie, milky glow. The destroyers pushed through the water at 30 knots, their powerful engines driving them forward, their wakes churning up the phosphorescent plankton that lived in these tropical waters. From the air, they must have looked like three glowing arrows pointing straight at their destination. So much for the element of surprise. An hour before midnight, the first sign of trouble appeared. The radar operators on the Allen M. Sumner picked up an aircraft following them. Eugene Anderson, at his battle station operating a 40 anti-aircraft gun, spotted it first, a dark shadow moving through the mist. He recognized it immediately as a Mitsubishi Kai-46 reconnaissance plane, what the Americans called a Dyna. Without waiting for orders, Anderson opened fire. The bridge immediately ordered ceasefire. They were worried the tracers would give away their position. But it was too late for that. The Japanese plane had already radioed their location. 10 seconds after the ceasefire order, Anderson saw a red flash off the starboard bow, followed by an enormous explosion. The bomb had been aimed at the bridge but missed, detonating in the water just 30 yards from the ship. The explosion sent a cascade of water over the destroyer, mixed with chunks of shrapnel that rattled against the hull like hail on a tin roof. 13 men were wounded by the shrapnel, and the bow was peppered with holes, but the ship kept going. Captain Sampson, probably thinking about court-martialing whoever had opened fire without orders, drove his ship forward through a minefield and into Ormoc Bay. They entered the bay at exactly midnight, December 3rd, 1944. The timing seemed perfect. Reconnaissance had shown the Japanese were just starting to unload their transports. The three American destroyers were in a line abreast formation, with the Allen M. Sumner in the lead, the Cooper to starboard, and the Mole to port. This formation would allow them to bring maximum firepower forward while presenting the smallest possible target to the enemy. What they found in Ormoc Bay was not what they expected. Instead of a few lightly armed transports and a single escort, they faced a massive Japanese force. There were 6 destroyers, not one. There were multiple heavily armed fast transports, 2 LSDs built to warship standards, submarines, torpedo boats, and a small fleet of armed escorts. The bay was also defended by shore batteries, including guns heavy enough to sink a destroyer with a single hit. And overhead, despite the weather, Japanese aircraft circled like vultures. The first American ship to open fire was the Cooper, sending a full salvo into a Japanese transport that immediately erupted in flames. Within seconds, the Allen M. Sumner and Mole joined in, their 5-inch guns firing as fast as the crews could load them. The first 3 Japanese transports were hit almost simultaneously, exploding in multicolored fireballs, red, white, blue, green, and yellow flames shooting into the night sky. Captain Sampson quickly shifted the Allen M. Sumner's fire to shore installations. The destroyer's guns demolished a large crane used for unloading supplies, smashed warehouses and buildings, and destroyed docks. The 14 guns, including Anderson's mount, poured hundreds of rounds into the shore facilities, the explosive shells sparking as they hit their targets. The destruction was devastating. Later estimates suggested thousands of Japanese troops were killed or wounded in those first few minutes. But the Japanese were not caught completely off guard. 2 destroyers, the Cure and Take, had been patrolling the bay. These were Matsu-class destroyers, smaller than their American counterparts, but fast and armed with the deadly Type 93 Long Lance, torpedoes oxygen-fueled weapons that could travel over 20,000 yards at 50 knots, far superior to American torpedoes. The battle quickly became a confused melee. The confined waters of Ormoc Bay, shaped like a horseshoe, meant the American destroyers had to make constant high-speed reversing maneuvers to avoid running aground. They zigzagged frantically to dodge torpedoes, bombs, and shells. The night turned into what one sailor described as hell itself, the darkness lit by muzzle flashes, exploding ships, and tracers flying in every direction. Just after midnight, the three American destroyers made radar contact with the Cure and Take. The range was closing fast. This was going to be a knife fight, naval style. Within 10 minutes, the concentrated fire of the American ships sent the Cure to the bottom, the Japanese destroyer burning and exploding as she sank. But even as she died, the Take struck back. At 12:15 a.m., a long-lance torpedo slammed into the Cooper amidships. The explosion was catastrophic, breaking the destroyer's back. Eugene Anderson, firing his anti-aircraft gun at a diving bomber, glanced over to where the Cooper had been. For a brief second, he saw both her bow and stern rising out of the water, while her middle section, shrouded in steam and smoke, sank beneath the waves. Then she was gone. In less than 30 seconds, the Cooper had disappeared, taking 191 of her 329 crew members with her. The surviving sailors from the Cooper found themselves in a nightmare. The water was full of oil and debris, and Japanese aircraft strafed the survivors. The Allen M. Sumner and Mole couldn't stop to help. They were under continuous attack from aircraft, shore batteries, and enemy ships. Any attempt to rescue survivors would have made them sitting ducks. The men in the water would have to wait for rescue by PBY Catalina flying boats, which wouldn't come until the next day. The battle raged on. Anderson's gun mount shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, the 40 shells finding their targets despite his gun sights being covered with salt spray. The Allen M. Sumner's 5-inch guns were firing so rapidly that they exhausted their supply of flashless powder, the special ammunition that prevented muzzle flash at night. They had to switch to regular powder, which produced huge yellow flashes with each shot, lighting up the ship and making her an easy target. The gun crews were performing superhuman feats. In one 15-minute period, they fired over 1,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. Each shell weighed 52 pounds, and the crews were loading, firing, and ejecting the hot casings every 5 seconds, all while the ship heeled and rolled violently in turrets filled with smoke and fumes. The heat was overwhelming, the noise deafening, but they kept firing. At one point, Anderson saw something that showed just how confused the battle had become. A Japanese torpedo boat opened fire on one of its own sinking ships. The bay was such chaos that neither side could be entirely sure what they were shooting at. Burning ships, explosions, and tracers created a nightmare landscape where friend and foe were almost indistinguishable. The Americans were running low on everything: fuel, ammunition, and luck. The crews were exhausted. Captain John Zarm, the squadron commander aboard the Allen M. Sumner, looked at the situation and made the only decision he could. At approximately 1:30 a.m., he ordered the signal 180, reverse course, get out. But the Japanese weren't going to let them leave easily. As the 2 surviving American destroyers turned to escape, a Japanese destroyer charged straight at them. This was it, a point-blank duel, exactly what the Japanese had never expected from American destroyers. Both sides opened fire with everything they had. Anderson poured 40 rounds into the enemy ship, while tracers from both vessels created what looked like a fireworks factory explosion. The Japanese destroyer, like the HMS Hood before her, took a direct hit to her magazines. The explosion was instantaneous, and total one moment she was there, firing desperately. The next she was gone, with only water vapor marking where she'd been. The Allen M. Sumner and Mole raced out of Ormoc Bay at flank speed, actually exceeding their design speed as they fled. The Mole's crew thought the Allen M. Sumner was deliberately trying to leave them behind. She was going so fast. They made it out, but the ordeal wasn't over. Japanese aircraft continued to attack them until dawn. Both ships were damaged, The Allen M. Sumner had over 40 holes in her hull from the pre-battle bombing, and the mole had taken shell hits. But they survived. As the sun rose on December 3rd, the two destroyers limped back into Leyte Gulf. The crew of the Allen M. Sumner immediately set to work repairing their ship. They welded patches over the holes in the hull, cleaned up the shell casings and shrapnel littering the decks, repainted the gun turrets where the paint had been burned away by the constant firing. Within 48 hours, despite having barely slept, they had their ship ready for action again. The war wasn't going to wait for them to rest. The battle's immediate results were impressive. The three American destroyers had sunk three Japanese destroyers, four transport ships, and destroyed a complete shore installation. They'd shot down between 20 and 30 enemy aircraft. The Japanese losses in men and material were staggering. But the cost had been high. The Cooper lost with most of her crew, and dozens more wounded on the surviving ships. More importantly, the battle marked a turning point in the struggle for Leyte. The Japanese would continue trying to reinforce Ormoc Bay, but American forces now knew what they were facing. Future operations would be better prepared, with more ships and air support when possible. Within weeks, American ground forces would capture Ormoc City itself, finally cutting off Japanese reinforcements completely. But for the men who fought that night, the strategic implications were less important than the personal impact. Eugene Anderson would never forget the smells of that battle. The salt water and cordite, the burning paint and oil, the charred flesh, all mixed with the incongruous scent of tropical flowers wafting from the jungle. He remembered the sounds, the constant thunder of guns, the scream of diving aircraft, the splash of near misses, and that distinctive bong of a bomb hitting close aboard. The Allen M. Sumner would go on to serve throughout the rest of World War II. Just a month later, in January 1945, she would fall victim to a kamikaze attack during the invasion of Lingayen Gulf. The suicide plane crashed into her near the after stack, killing 14 men and wounding 19 more. She survived, was repaired, and returned to service, but the green crew that had entered Ormoc Bay was gone, replaced by veterans who had seen the worst war could offer. Captain Sampson, in his after-action report, praised his crew's performance. "I consider the performance of all officers and the entire crew outstanding," he wrote. "This engagement was the first real fight in which this vessel has participated. A comparatively green crew weathered a 4-hour air attack while under fire of shore batteries and delivered destructive gunfire, which sank 2 enemy ships and destroyed 8 planes." But his words, while true, couldn't capture the full reality of what happened that night. How do you describe the feeling of sailing into enemy waters, knowing you're outnumbered and outgunned? How do you explain the courage it takes to keep loading and firing guns while bombs and shells explode around you? How do you honor the memory of the Cooper's crew, who died so quickly they probably never knew what hit them? The Battle of Ormoc Bay has been called the forgotten battle of World War II. It lacks the fame of Midway or Leyte Gulf. No movies have been made about it, no famous books written. But historian Irwin Capps, who served on the mole during the battle, argues that this neglect is unjust. This was the only naval battle of the Pacific War where American forces faced every type of weapon. The enemy could bring to bear surface ships, aircraft, submarines, shore batteries, and mines, all in one desperate action. The battle also demonstrated something important about the American destroyer force. These tin cans, as they were dismissively called, were capable of extraordinary things when pushed to their limits. The Allen M. Sumner and her sisters weren't supposed to take on an entire enemy fleet in confined waters. They were supposed to screen carriers and hunt submarines. But when called upon, they charged into hell itself and emerged victorious. The Japanese never expected American destroyers to close to point-blank range and slug it out. Their naval doctrine emphasized long-range torpedo attacks, using the superior range of their long lance torpedoes to strike from beyond gun range. But the confined waters of Ormoc Bay negated this advantage. The American destroyers, with their radar-directed guns and aggressive tactics, turned the battle into a brutal close-quarters brawl that the Japanese were not prepared for. This aggressive spirit was part of what made the US Navy so effective in the Pacific War. While the Japanese often relied on complex plans and precise timing, American commanders were trained to be aggressive, to seek out the enemy and destroy them. This difference in philosophy would be demonstrated again and again throughout the war, but rarely as dramatically as in Ormoc Bay. The Alan M. Sumner would survive the war, going on to serve in Korea and Vietnam. She would earn battle stars for all three conflicts, a remarkable record of service. But for many of her crew, that night in Ormoc Bay would remain their defining moment. Years later, at reunions, they would still talk about it, the terror and excitement, the pride and sorrow, all mixed together in memories that never faded. The ship herself would serve until 1973, when she was finally decommissioned and sold for scrap. By then, she was an anachronism, her guns and torpedoes replaced by missiles and helicopters on newer ships. But the lessons learned in battles like Ormoc Bay, the importance of radar, the need for coordinated air and sea operations, the value of aggressive action, would be incorporated into the modern Navy. There's another aspect of the Alan M. Sumner story that deserves mention. Like all ships of her era, she was built with extensive use of asbestos for insulation and fireproofing. This material, which seemed so useful at the time, would later prove deadly to many sailors who served aboard these ships. Long after the Japanese guns fell silent, veterans would still be dying from mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases, a different kind of casualty from a different kind of war. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond that night in December 1944. The survivors of the Cooper spent hours in the water, covered in oil, trying to avoid Japanese strafing runs. When PBY Catalinas finally arrived to rescue them the next day, the flying boats took off, carrying thousands of pounds more than they were designed to handle. Some survivors made it to shore and had to escape through Japanese-held territory. Of the 329 men aboard the Cooper, only 168 survived. For the families back home, the battle was just a few lines in the newspaper, if it was mentioned at all. The Navy's communiques were typically terse. 3 destroyers engaged enemy forces in Ormoc Bay. 1 destroyer lost. Enemy losses heavy. Behind those clinical words were hundreds of personal tragedies, mothers who would never see their sons again, wives who would become widows before they turned 20, children who would grow up without fathers. One of those who died was the Cooper's captain, Commander Mel Peterson. He had been in command for less than 6 months, taking over the ship in July 1944. By all accounts, he was a good officer, respected by his crew. When the torpedo hit, he was on the bridge, trying to fight his ship. He went down with her, as naval tradition demanded, but one wonders what thoughts went through his mind in those final seconds as his ship broke apart beneath him. The Japanese losses were even heavier. The destroyer Kua went down with most of her crew, probably over 200 men. The transports that were destroyed were packed with soldiers heading for the fighting on Leyte. Thousands died in the explosions and fires, many of them young conscripts who had been farmers or factory workers just months before. They died for an empire that was already doomed, though they didn't know it yet. The battle also demonstrated the changing nature of naval warfare. This was not the kind of engagement that naval theorists had envisioned before the war. There were no battle lines, no grand maneuvers. It was a confused, desperate fight in confined waters, where technology, radar, and training mattered more than tradition or tactics. The side that could adapt fastest, that could maintain control in chaos, would win. The Alan M. Sumner's radar played a crucial role that night. While the Japanese had to rely on searchlights and star shells to see their targets, both of which made them vulnerable to return fire, the Americans could track targets in complete darkness. This technological advantage, combined with the superior training of American radar operators, gave the US destroyers a critical edge in the confusion of battle. But technology alone didn't win the battle. It was the courage and skill of the crews that made the difference. Men like Eugene Anderson, who kept firing his anti-aircraft gun even as bombs exploded around him. The ammunition handlers who formed human chains to pass shells from the magazines to the guns, working in heat that could literally cook a man. The engineers who kept the engines running at maximum power, knowing that speed was their only defense against torpedoes. The battle had wider implications for the Philippines campaign. The Japanese had been successfully reinforcing Leyte for weeks, using their night runs to build up their forces. If this had continued, the American invasion might have bogged down, costing thousands more casualties and possibly delaying the liberation of the Philippines by months. The action at Ormoc Bay, costly as it was, helped ensure that American forces could secure Leyte and move on to Luzon and the eventual invasion of Japan itself. It's worth considering what might have happened if the three destroyers had failed that night. If the Japanese conv had gotten through intact, if the shore installations had remained operational, if American forces had been forced to retreat without inflicting significant damage, the Japanese might have been able to continue reinforcing Leyte indefinitely, turning it into a meat grinder that would have consumed American forces for months. The Alan M. Sumner and her crew prevented that. They went into Ormoc Bay expecting an easy fight and found themselves in a nightmare. But they didn't run. They stood and fought against overwhelming odds, and they won. It wasn't pretty or glorious naval battles rarely are, but it was necessary. As the war progressed, the Alan M. Sumner would participate in the invasion of Luzon, where she would face her kamikaze attacker. She would be there for the bombardment of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She would even be heading for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs ended the war. Through it all, the crew would remember that night in Ormoc Bay as their real baptism of fire. The ship would go on to serve in the Korean War, providing gunfire support for UN forces and screening aircraft carriers. During the Vietnam War, she would return to the gunline, her 5-inch guns once again pounding enemy positions. But these conflicts, important as they were, never matched the intensity of that night battle in the Philippines. Veterans of the battle would stay in touch over the years. They formed an association, holding reunions where they could share memories that only they could understand. As the years passed, their numbers dwindled, but the bonds forged that night never weakened. They had faced death together, had seen friends die, had somehow survived. That created a connection that civilian life could never break. Eugene Anderson, whose first-hand account provides much of what we know about the battle from the enlisted man's perspective, would carry the memories for the rest of his life. The sights, sounds, and smells of battle never left him. He could still recall, decades later, the exact sequence of events, the faces of his shipmates, the terror and exhilaration of combat. In his account, Anderson mentioned something that captures the surreal nature of the battle. Amid all the death and destruction, with shells exploding and ships burning, he could smell the tropical flowers from the nearby jungle. That juxtaposition, the sweet scent of flowers mixing with the acrid smell of cordite and burning oil, seemed to symbolize the whole Pacific War, where Paradise Islands became killing grounds. The tactical lessons from Ormoc Bay would be studied and applied in future operations. The importance of accurate intelligence became clear. The three destroyers had been told to expect light resistance and instead faced a major enemy force. The need for better coordination between air and naval forces was highlighted. The value of radar-directed gunfire was proven beyond doubt. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the human element in warfare. Technology and tactics matter, but ultimately, battles are won by people, by their courage, skill, and determination. The crew of the Alan M. Sumner demonstrated all three that night. They were mostly young men, many still teenagers who had never been in combat before. But when tested, they performed magnificently. The Japanese learned lessons too. They realized that American destroyers would aggressively engage even when outnumbered. They saw the effectiveness of American radar and rapid-fire guns. They understood that their advantage in torpedo range meant less in confined waters. But by then, it was too late to change the course of the war. As we look back on the Battle of Ormoc Bay from the perspective of decades, it's easy to reduce it to statistics and strategic implications. 3 destroyers engaged, 1 lost. Enemy forces destroyed, reinforcement route cut. Mission accomplished. But that misses the human drama of what happened that night. Think about what it must have been like for a 19-year-old sailor, away from home for the first time, suddenly thrust into a battle where death could come from any direction, from the air, from the sea, from the shore. The noise alone must have been overwhelming, the constant roar of guns, the shriek of diving aircraft, the explosion of bombs and shells. And through it all, they had to keep doing their jobs, loading guns, tracking targets, damage control. The officers faced their own challenges. They had to make split-second decisions that would mean life or death for their crews. Captain Sampson, watching the Cooper disappear in seconds, knowing he couldn't stop to rescue survivors, had to live with that decision for the rest of his life. It was the right military decision, but that didn't make it any easier. Commander Zarm, the squadron commander, had to balance aggression with survival. Stay too long and all 3 destroyers might be lost. Leave too early and the mission would fail. He made the right call, but only barely. A few more minutes, and the Alan M. Sumner and Mole might have joined the Cooper on the bottom of Ormoc Bay. The battle also showed the importance of training and preparation. Despite being a green crew, the Alan M. Sumner's sailors performed well because they had been drilled relentlessly. They knew their jobs and did them even under the most extreme pressure. When the flashless powder ran out, they switched to regular powder without missing a beat. When targets appeared, they engaged them immediately. This automatic competence, built through countless hours of practice, saved lives that night. There's a tendency in military history to focus on the big battles, the famous victories and defeats. Midway, Pearl Harbor, Leyte Gulf. These are the battles everyone knows. But the Pacific War was won through hundreds of smaller actions like Ormoc Bay, where a few ships and a few hundred men made a difference that rippled outward to affect the entire campaign. The Alan M. Sumner story reminds us that heroism isn't always recognized or rewarded. No medals of honor were awarded for Ormoc Bay. The battle barely rated a mention in most histories of World War II. But the men who fought there were heroes nonetheless. They did their duty under impossible conditions and prevailed against overwhelming odds. As the years passed and the Alan M. Sumner continued her service through Korea and Vietnam, new crews would come aboard. They would hear stories about that night in Ormoc Bay, passed down like naval folklore. Some would believe them, others would think they were exaggerated. How could 3 destroyers take on an entire Japanese fleet and survive? How could green kids perform like veterans? But the battle damage reports, the casualty lists, and the enemy ships on the bottom of the bay told the true story. The ship would finally meet her end, not in battle, but in a scrapyard in 1974. By then, most Americans had forgotten about Ormoc Bay, if they ever knew about it at all. The age of missile warfare had arrived, and World War II seemed like ancient history. But for the men who served on the Alan M. Sumner, especially those who were there that night in December 1944, the ship would always be special. Today, there are very few survivors of the Battle of Ormoc Bay left. Time has done what Japanese guns couldn't do, thin the ranks of the men who fought that night. But their story deserves to be remembered, not because it was the biggest battle or the most decisive, but because it shows what ordinary Americans could do when everything was on the line. The legacy of the Alan M. Sumner and her crew extends beyond their military achievements. They were part of the generation that saved democracy, that stopped fascism and militarism from conquering the world. They didn't see themselves as heroes. Most would bristle at the word, but that's exactly what they were. They left their homes, faced death, and prevailed. But there's another legacy, a darker one that would only become apparent years later. The asbestos that insulated the ship's pipes and boilers, that made her fireproof in battle, would prove to be a silent killer. Many veterans who survived the Japanese would later die from mesothelioma, their lungs destroyed by the microscopic fibers they inhaled during their service. It's a cruel irony. The very material that helped protect them in combat would eventually kill them in peace. This hidden danger affects how we should remember these men. They didn't just risk their lives for a few months or years during the war. For many, their service would exact a price that wouldn't come due for decades. They are casualties of war just as surely as those who died in Ormoc Bay, just with a longer fuse. As we near the end of this story, it's important to consider what it all meant. The Battle of Ormoc Bay was a tactical victory that contributed to strategic success in the Philippines. It demonstrated American naval superiority and hastened the end of Japanese resistance on Leyte. But more than that, it was a human drama of courage, sacrifice, and survival. The three destroyers that entered Ormoc Bay that night represented the best of American naval power, not just in terms of technology and firepower, but in the quality of their crews. Young men from all over America, farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York, cowboys from Texas, came together, learned to work as a team, and accomplished the impossible. Their enemy that night was formidable. The Japanese Navy, even in late 1944, was still dangerous. Their sailors were experienced, their weapons were excellent, and they had the advantage of position. They should have won. On paper, three destroyers, even new ones, shouldn't have been able to fight off six enemy destroyers, multiple submarines, shore batteries, and constant air attack. But paper doesn't account for human courage. The story of the Alan M. Sumner also reflects the broader American war effort. This was a ship built in New Jersey, with steel from Pennsylvania, armed with guns from Connecticut, and radar from Massachusetts. She was crewed by boys from every state, commanded by officers trained at Annapolis and reserve officers from civilian colleges. She represented America's industrial might and democratic spirit combined into a fighting machine. But let's return to that night in December 1944, to those final moments as the Alan M. Sumner and Mole raced out of Ormoc Bay. Behind them, Japanese ships burned on the water. The shore installations were in ruins. Enemy aircraft circled like angry hornets, dropping bombs and strafing, but unable to stop the escaping destroyers. The Cooper was gone, her wreck already settling into the mud at the bottom of the bay, her surviving crew members struggling in all-covered water, praying for rescue. Eugene Anderson, exhausted from hours of combat, his hands blistered from handling hot ammunition, his ears ringing from the constant gunfire, looked back at the hell they were leaving behind. The entire bay seemed to be on fire, a scene from Dante's Inferno transplanted to the tropical Pacific. He had survived, but barely. Many of his shipmates were wounded. Friends on the Cooper were dead or missing. As dawn broke on December 3rd, 1944, the two surviving destroyers limped into Leyte Gulf. They had accomplished their mission. The Japanese convoy was destroyed. The reinforcement of Leyte disrupted. But the cost had been high. The Cooper and 191 of her men were gone. Dozens more were wounded. The Alan M. Sumner had over 40 holes in her hull. Both surviving ships would need repairs before they could fight again. But they had won. Against all odds, facing a force that should have destroyed them, they had prevailed. It wasn't luck or divine intervention. It was training, technology, courage, and sheer determination. It was American sailors doing what American sailors have always done, fighting hard, never giving up, and finding a way to win. The Battle of Ormoc Bay would be overshadowed by larger events. Just days later, American forces would land on Mindoro. Within weeks, the invasion of Luzon would begin. The war would move on, leaving Ormoc Bay as just another forgotten battlefield. But for those who were there, who saw the Cooper die, who felt the heat of explosions and heard the screams of the wounded, it would never be forgotten. Years later, when Eugene Anderson was an old man, he would still remember every detail of that night. The fear and excitement, the pride and horror, all mixed together in memories that time couldn't dim. He would remember his shipmates, boys who became men in the crucible of combat. He would remember Captain Sampson, cool under fire, commanding his ship with skill and courage. He would remember the Japanese too, brave sailors who fought and died for their country, even though their cause was doomed. This is the real legacy of the Alan M. Sumner and the Battle of Ormoc Bay. Not the statistics or strategic implications, but the human story. Young men facing death, overcoming fear, doing their duty. It's a story that has been repeated countless times throughout history, But that doesn't make it less remarkable. Every generation produces such men, ordinary people who do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The Alan M. Sumner herself would serve for almost 30 more years after Ormoc Bay. She would see the atomic age dawn, would participate in the Cold War, would adapt to new technologies and new threats. But she would never again face a test quite like that night in December 1944. That was her finest hour, the moment when she and her crew proved themselves in the ultimate trial of combat. Today, there are no Alan M. Sumner-class destroyers left in service. They've all been scrapped or sunk as targets. But one ship of the class, the USS Laffey, survives as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks, see her guns, get some sense of what these ships were like. But they can't really understand what it was like to fight in one, to face death in a steel box, to depend on your shipmates for survival. That's why stories like this matter. They connect us to our past, help us understand the price of freedom, the cost of victory. The men who fought at Ormoc Bay didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just doing their job, serving their country, trying to survive and help their buddies survive. But that's what heroism really is: ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because they have to. As we come to the end of this story, let's return one more time to that moment when the Japanese torpedo hit the Cooper. In less than 30 seconds, 191 men died. They had no time to say goodbye, no chance to write final letters home. They were there one moment, gone the next. Their sacrifice helped win the Battle of Ormoc Bay, helped secure Leyte, helped win the war. But they would never know that. They died thinking they were in just another naval skirmish, not knowing they were part of history. The survivors of the Cooper floated in the dark water, covered in oil, listening to the battle rage on without them. Some were badly wounded. All were in shock. They could see their sister ships fighting, could see the flashes of gunfire and explosions, but they were helpless. All they could do was try to stay afloat, try to stay together, try to survive until rescue came. When the PBY flying boats finally arrived the next day, they performed their own act of heroism. These planes, nicknamed Black Cats because of their black paint scheme, were designed for reconnaissance and rescue, not for operating at maximum weight. But they loaded every survivor they could find, taking off dangerously overloaded, engines straining, barely clearing the water. The pilots risked their own lives to save the Cooper's crew, another example of the courage that was commonplace that day. Some survivors made it to shore and had to escape through Japanese-held territory. Think about that. After surviving a torpedo attack, after hours in the water, they had to evade enemy patrols and make their way through jungle to friendly lines. It's a testament to their training and determination that any of them made it. The impact of the battle rippled outward in ways large and small. Families received telegrams that would change their lives forever. We regret to inform you. Communities lost favorite sons. The Cooper's captain, Commander Peterson, left behind a widow and children who would grow up without their father. Each loss was a tragedy, a story cut short, potential unrealized. But from these individual tragedies came collective victory. The sacrifice at Ormoc Bay, combined with thousands of other sacrifices across the Pacific, brought the war closer to its end. Each battle won, each Japanese reinforcement stopped, each day the enemy was weakened, brought peace closer. The men who died at Ormoc Bay helped purchase that peace with their lives. It's important to remember that the Japanese sailors who died that night were also brave men doing their duty. They knew by December 1944 that the war was going badly, that America's industrial might was overwhelming them. But they fought on, loyal to their emperor and their country. The crews of the Cure and Take fought skillfully and courageously. They managed to sink an American destroyer despite being outnumbered and outgunned. In another time, under different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than enemies. War is ultimately about such waste: brave men killing other brave men, potential destroyed, futures erased. The Battle of Ormoc Bay, for all its tactical success, was part of this larger tragedy. But given the nature of the Japanese military government, Given their refusal to surrender despite the obvious hopelessness of their situation, battles like Ormoc Bay were necessary. Each one brought the war's end closer, ultimately saving lives by shortening the conflict. The Alan M. Sumner would go on from Ormoc Bay to face other challenges, other battles. But for her crew, especially those who were there that night, nothing would ever match the intensity of those hours in the Philippines. Combat veterans often talk about how war is long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Ormoc Bay was several hours of sustained terror, a compression of a war's worth of combat into one night. When the Alan M. Sumner was finally decommissioned in 1973, some of her Ormoc Bay veterans attended the ceremony. They were middle-aged men by then, with families and careers, lives built in the peace their service had helped secure. But for a moment, standing on those familiar decks, they were young again, remembering that night when they stared death in the face and somehow survived. The ship was sold for scrap in 1974, cut up and melted down, her steel probably recycled into cars or buildings. It seems an ignominious end for a ship with such a distinguished record. But ships, like the men who sail them, are mortal. What matters is not the physical structure, but the legacy, the memory, the lessons learned. Today, as we face new challenges and new threats, the story of the Alan M. Sumner and Ormoc Bay remains relevant. It reminds us that technology alone doesn't win battles, people do. It shows us that courage and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. It teaches us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when their country needs them. The story also reminds us of the cost of freedom. The men who died at Ormoc Bay, American and Japanese alike, paid the ultimate price. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The families of the dead carried their own burden of loss. Freedom isn't free, it's purchased with blood and courage, sacrifice and sorrow. But perhaps the most important lesson from Ormoc Bay is about the resilience of the human spirit. Faced with overwhelming odds, in a situation where retreat would have been understandable, even sensible, the crews of 3 American destroyers pressed forward. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for each other, for their ships, for their country, and for the ideals that country represented. Eugene Anderson, the young signalman whose account has guided us through this story, lived to be an old man. He married, had children, built a life in the peace he helped create. But he never forgot that night in December 1944. How could he? It was the night when he discovered what he was capable of, when he and his shipmates faced the worst that war could offer and prevailed. In his later years, Anderson would attend reunions of Ormoc Bay veterans. The attendance got smaller each year as time claimed those whom Japanese guns couldn't kill. But those who came shared a bond that nothing could break. They had faced death together, had seen the worst and best of humanity on the same night. They were members of an exclusive club, one whose membership fee was paid in blood and courage. As Anderson and his fellow veterans grew old and began to pass away, they worried that their story would be forgotten. They had seen how quickly the public moved on from World War II, how the Korean War became forgotten, how Vietnam divided the country. They worried that the sacrifices at Ormoc Bay would disappear into the mists of history, just another forgotten battle in a war increasingly distant from public memory. That's why accounts like Anderson's are so important. They preserve not just the facts of what happened, but the feeling of it, the fear and courage, the chaos and clarity, the horror and heroism. They remind us that history is not just about grand strategies and famous generals, but about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Battle of Ormoc Bay deserves to be remembered not because it was the biggest or most decisive battle of World War II, but because it exemplifies the American fighting spirit at its best. 3 destroyers against an entire enemy fleet. Green kids against veteran sailors. Technology and training against numbers and position. And in the end, courage made the difference. As we near the conclusion of this story, let's consider what would have happened if the Alan M. Sumner, Mole, and Cooper had not entered Ormoc Bay that night. The Japanese conv would have successfully reinforced Leyte. American ground forces would have faced stronger resistance. The campaign would have taken longer, cost more lives. The war itself might have been extended by weeks or months. Every day the war continued meant more people died, more cities were destroyed, more families were shattered. By their actions that night, the crews of 3 destroyers shortened the war, if only by a little. They saved lives, American and Japanese, by helping to hasten the inevitable conclusion. This is the paradox of war. Sometimes you have to fight and kill to ultimately save lives. The men who fought at Ormoc Bay understood this. They didn't want to be there, didn't want to kill or risk being killed, but they understood that their duty, their sacrifice, served a greater purpose. The story of the Alan M. Sumner also reflects the tremendous industrial and organizational achievement of the United States during World War II. This ship was one of 58 Alan M. Sumner-class destroyers built during the war. Think about that, 58 ships of this class alone, each one representing millions of dollars, thousands of tons of steel, countless hours of labor. And this was just one class of destroyer among many. The ability to produce such quantities of complex weapons while simultaneously training the crews to operate them effectively was perhaps America's greatest advantage in the war. But all that industrial might would have been useless without the human element. The best ship in the world is just floating steel without a trained, motivated crew. The Alan M. Sumner had both the ship and the crew, and that combination proved deadly to America's enemies. Now, as our story draws to a close, let's think about what the Battle of Ormoc Bay means for us today. We live in a different world, with different threats and challenges. The age of destroyer gun battles is long past, replaced by missiles and cyber warfare. But the fundamental qualities that won at Ormoc Bay, courage, training, determination, sacrifice, remain as important as ever. The young men and women who serve in today's military are the spiritual heirs of the sailors who fought at Ormoc Bay. They volunteer to put themselves in harm's way to defend their country and its ideals. They deserve our respect and support, just as the veterans of World War II deserved and received the nation's gratitude.